بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Brothers and sisters and friends, and welcome to another episode of the GDM show, the Global Dawah Movement show. Actually, I haven't been doing many of these shows. I've been traveling, so hopefully I'll be able to engage with you a little bit more, bi'idhnillah, inshallah, God willing. Today we're going to be talking about, and bear with me, epistemic justification. Yes, it's a huge, crazy word. It doesn't really mean much. It means justifying your sources of knowledge, or justifying the methods that you use to get knowledge. It's as simple as that. And the reason we want to discuss this today is because I remember an amazing YouTube clip. It's Richard Dawkins, and basically he was asked a question about this topic, epistemic justification. He was asked, in a nutshell, how do we justify science? Yes, we need evidence for things, but how do we justify the statement that we need scientific evidence for things, essentially? Actually, listen to the clip here.
So the question's about the nature of scientific evidence. You both said, and I think most people here would agree with you, that we're justified in holding a belief if there's evidence for it, or if there are logical arguments we can find that support it. But it seems like this in itself is a belief which would require some form of evidence. And so if so, I'm wondering what you think would count as evidence in favour of that, and if not, how do we justify choosing that heuristic without appealing to the same standard that we're trying to justify?
So how do we justify, as it were, faith that science will give us the truth? Is that the...
Please.
How do you justify scientific method?
Yes.
Basically, what he said.
It works. It works. Planes fly, cars drive, computers compute.
It's an inductive argument.
If you base medicine on science, you cure people. If you base the design of planes on science, they fly. If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works, bitches.
So, brothers and sisters, sorry for the expletive, but I'm here today with Sabur Ahmed to discuss this. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. How you doing, bro? Good. So we want to attack this from two perspectives. The first thing, as you can see from what Richard Dawkins was saying, is that science is justified. It leads to certainty, or to truth, or to knowledge, because it works. Is that statement itself valid?
I would say the history of science tells a slightly different story. So if you look at the history of science, we have theories that have worked really well, and they have produced results. A body of literature have been peer-reviewed, and we actually found out that even though they worked and they helped us gain new knowledge, the background assumptions or the theoretical framework wasn't correct at all. And in some cases, it wasn't right completely. So you can gain new knowledge, and science can work, and you can make technological advancements based upon a falsehood. So
Give me an example.
okay, so a very simple example is we went to the moon based upon Newtonian mechanics, and Newtonian mechanics is something which has been superseded by the Einsteinian worldview. Now, one of the fundamental assumptions of Newtonian mechanics is time and space is fixed.
Yes.
And Einstein showed, using various methods which are generally accepted now, that time and space are relative, dynamic, and changing. Now, even though we went to space based upon Newtonian mechanics, Apollo 11 landed there, we gained new knowledge based upon all of Newtonian mechanics that we applied. The fundamental assumptions were incorrect. So even though this is a prime example of something that works, the background assumptions in a theoretical framework wasn't true in an absolute sense.
So Richard Dawkins cannot therefore say that we can justify the truth of science based upon the fact that it works, because there are things that have shown to work based on falsehoods, essentially, based on something that's not true.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. What about something that I think is a Greek word, phlogiston?
Phlogiston, that's quite an interesting one, because again, this was a scientific fact held by chemists that
Well, fact at the time.
at the time, right? That all objects are made of this substance called phlogiston.
Which allow things to combust and burn.
Exactly right. So when something burns off, it's because of phlogiston, and they had this as a maxim, as in everyone accepted it, and this was used within all their theoretical frameworks. Now, when they discovered nitrogen, they explained their discovery based upon phlogiston
Yeah.
theory. When they discovered oxygen, again, it was linked to the phlogiston theory. And once they did an experiment, and this experiment gave a result which showed that phlogiston was
False.
it didn't exist at all.
So phlogiston as a theory, a fact at the time, was false, but it led to future truths that we now know to be true.
And we're still using
And we're still
oxygen,
using.
nitrogen, yeah.
So it goes to show that just because something works, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lead to truth, or if it works, it doesn't mean it can justify something as being true.
Yeah.
So Richard Dawkins is wrong from that perspective.
Of course he is, and this is something that academics
Why do
know.
you think he's wrong?
Well, history shows him to be wrong. The other thing is that when you look within the academic world, they speak about,
Are you saying Richard Dawkins is an academic? He's a professor.
well, there's various grades of within academia. So when it comes to the philosophy side of things,
Are you a
scientists-
professor?
I'm not, but I have a brain. Which
Are you saying that Richard Dawkins has no brain? Go on.
No. I'm saying no one has the right to monopolize any sort of knowledge. We all have brains. We all can think for ourselves. So if you look within academia, you have people like the philosopher Elliot Sober, and he speaks in his book Evidence and Evolution, the science behind the logic behind the science, that theories which give better predictive results, which actually work, are more likely, this is based on research, to be wrong.
Okay. So
So-
from that perspective, the reason I'm asking this question is because I have a stance on this issue, and I may be wrong, that I think Richard Dawkins either doesn't know much about the philosophy of science, or he does, and he deliberately doesn't want people to learn about the philosophy of science, because he will realize, or rather, he will be inadvertently pushing people towards an understanding of science that's far more academic and nuanced, and he will get challenged on his evolution is an absolute fact.
And if you
or-
deny it, you must be insane, stupid, or wicked. or
Exactly.
something
And
like
by the way, that doesn't mean we're denying evolution scientifically, but what we're saying is, what is the epistemic value? What's its value of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Is it certain or is it work in progress?
And this is the thing that
And that's the danger, because I think since starting to study philosophy and the philosophy of science on a postgraduate level, I've seen all of this amazing work by amazing philosophers and thinkers and scientists. I'm like, why isn't this popularized? Okay, so what's the next question? You're supposed to ask me a question now, bro.
when it comes to the philosophical side of things, now this is a very deep question because we already established that it can work, but it doesn't
Yeah,
mean it's true. Is there a way that we can justify the scientific method without applying to the same method that we're trying to justify?
No. Essentially, this concerns the area of epistemic justification. And David Hume, we always refer to David Hume, the problem of induction, right? He was basically focusing on induction. He was basically saying that since induction is moving from the particular to the general, since induction is moving from a certain set of observations to the unobserved,
Yep.
then you're never going to have certain knowledge. So he dealt with that. That's well known in the philosophy of science and in philosophy in general, in epistemology, in the study of knowledge, that induction doesn't lead to certainty. This is well known because philosophers, especially at that time, always wanted deductive arguments about things, meaning that the conclusion has to necessarily follow, but induction doesn't necessarily follow. For example, I observe 1,000 white sheep, therefore all sheep are white. That's not conclusive, it's not certain.
Yeah.
The conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. It could be that I may have a future observation or another observation that denies
Previous conclusions,
my previous conclusions and my generalizations. However, now the reason we're talking about induction is because science uses induction as a source of knowledge and as a method to lead to knowledge, right? Now, what David Hume said, he moved on and said, well, not only does induction lead to uncertainties, in other words, induction doesn't lead to certainty, you can't even justify induction. And if you can't justify induction, you can't even justify science, because science actually works with induction. It rests itself on induction because that's the thing that he uses.
You're trying to justify that as circular reasoning.
It's circular reasoning, and this is what he basically said. He said the only way that you can justify induction is by having an assumption. There's a hidden assumption, and that assumption is, in his own words, the future resembles the past.
Uniformity of nature.
Yes, many academics now are basically saying nature is uniform, because if you have that assumption, then actually you can justify not only induction but the entire scientific enterprise.
Yeah.
But then he exposes that assumption. But let's first show why, by having that assumption, if it's sound, you'll be able to justify the whole scientific enterprise. Let me give you an example. 1,000 sheep I have observed are white. Nature is uniform. The future resembles the past. Therefore, all sheep are white.
Yeah.
If my hidden assumption is true, my conclusion necessarily follows. Because even if I observed 2 sheep, 200 sheep, or 2,000 sheep, if nature is uniform, if the future resembles the past, then it necessarily follows that all sheep are white. But David Hume says, hold on a second. That's a naughty assumption. Obviously, he doesn't say that. I'm just paraphrasing from the literature. And he basically says, you can't justify that. You can't prove that. Because the only way to know that nature is uniform, the only way to know that the future apparently resembles the past is by using induction, which he said is arguing in a circle. You're proving induction using induction. You haven't justified anything philosophically.
That's kind of interesting, because when Richard Dawkins was actually making that computers compute, when you design rockets based upon science, they go to the moon. It's interesting you use that example. When you base medicine on science, people are cured. And with him was the philosopher Stephen Law, who I believe you've debated as well.
So have you?
And he just murmured, that's an inductive argument. So that's quite interesting.
Professor Stephen Law actually said that. He said that's an inductive argument. I don't know if he was using it to support Dawkins' case, but I really respect Stephen Law, and he's a philosopher.
He's honest, right.
He studies this, and he's basically saying, well, you can't really prove induction using induction.
I think he didn't.
And that's why he whispered, that's an inductive argument. So, just to summarize what we've been saying, I wrote this in my actually first postgraduate essay, and this is what I conclude when I'm talking about induction, because I wrote an essay called, what was the question? It was,
is inductive knowledge possible?
Oh, thanks, bro. Is inductive knowledge possible? And I say, in summary, Hume's argument is that we cannot logically demonstrate induction, meaning you cannot show that it's deductively valid, it leads to certainty, you cannot show that it's epistemically justified. And I continue, the assumption that nature is uniform is based on induction, and therefore to use this assumption as a means to validate induction, and then I quote Rosenberg, is like underwriting your promise to pay back a loan by promising you will keep your promises.
Circular.
It's a circular argument from that perspective. So people need to learn the philosophy of science in order to be good scientists. And many philosophers of science, especially at university, they totally understand this, and many of them are scientists themselves. And therefore they have a more nuanced, practical approach to the whole scientific fact discussion. You know what's very interesting as well, Sabor, is that why is there such a disconnect between academia, the nuanced discussion about science and certainty and facts, and what happens on the popular sphere?
I would say, one, most people accept science based upon trust. They don't do the science themselves. But then I would slightly disagree with you and say some people who are right in there in terms of science, they have their hands dirty, right? They would actually, and these aren't people that you hear about on the news, these aren't people, these are grafters, these are hard workers, these aren't popularizers. For example, the senior editor of Nature, which is the most important journal in the world, his name is Henry Gee, he's a biologist. He says all scientific conclusions are provisional, they can be nothing else.
But you've proven my point. The point is he's not a popularizer. So why is there a disconnect between the academics and the popularizers like Richard Dawkins and others?
I think maybe there's a few factors. One is a lack of knowledge of philosophy. Other factors I don't want to go into, but I think that's generally a problem.
Yes. So the irony is, though, if we follow the kind of Dawkins narrative of things, you know, working and therefore they're true, etc., what would that do to current physics?
Okay, take for example, quantum mechanics, and if you walk up to any physics teacher and say, is quantum mechanics true? Does it give predictive results which are correct? Say yes, it gives very precise predictions which are true. Okay, is general relativity true? And does it also give predictions which come true? Of course it does. You can find out where a planet is based upon general relativity.
Newtonian physics.
Yeah. So these two, general relativity and quantum mechanics, these are both taken as...
Well, you could add Newtonian physics there as well,
of course.
Right?
You use this and you use this, but fundamentally there is a contradiction. If you say this is the truth and this is the truth...
So not only both of them, but all three of them can generally contradict with each other.
Yeah.
They're non-complementary paradigms. But therefore...
How are you going to do science?
You're still doing the science.
For example, when we went to space in the 1960s, we knew general relativity was true and the Newtonian concept of the universe was incorrect.
Yes.
But we still based rocket science to go to the moon based upon Newtonian mechanics.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So scientists know you can have provisional truths and you work together. It's kind of like, if you can't ride two horses, you have no job being in the circus. So scientists know we need to bet on this horse, and all of them are going to give us new knowledge.
Yes.
If you go with that approach of, this is a fact and it's set in stone and it's never going to change, you've made science rigid, you've made science what it is not.
And you lost its beauty.
Yeah. You can't actually do science like that. It's very impractical.
So just to summarize, from a kind of theistic Islamic perspective, the reason we talk about these things, brothers and sisters, is not to deny the science. We love the science. The more we're reading about it and studying at university, we're loving it even more. But it's just to show the actual truth that underlines and underpins science, which is some of its assumptions and its philosophy. And therefore, by understanding it properly, then from a religious perspective, you won't have a problem if science today contradicts some religious truths, especially if you believe revelation to be its own source of knowledge that you could justify outside of science, which is a different discussion. So therefore, it doesn't matter if one day, for example, scientific hypothesis X contradicts Quranic verse Y. It doesn't matter. It makes no difference because science doesn't really lead to certainty. There is always a possibility of another observation at odds with the generalizations, or another observation at odds with your previous observations that you use to form conclusions. And also, the method itself can't even be justified from an epistemological perspective, right? Because you require nature's uniform assumption, and that can only be understood via induction.
Yeah,
and therefore, you're proving induction with induction, which is a secular argument. So the point is, you have all of these issues. So don't worry, guys. If there is a striking contradiction, or something seems to be unscientific, just turn down the certainty knob a bit and take a chill pill. Once you study the philosophy of science, understand some of these issues, you'll have what I'll call intellectual sakina, intellectual tranquility. Science is evolving, don't mind the pun, and it can change. It doesn't mean we reject the science, because my practical position is this, just to end.
It's an instrument.
It's an instrument. Accept the science. Accept, for example, even if it's Darwinism, from a scientific perspective, as a scientist, you're working within the assumptions, you're working within that paradigm, and you're doing the scientific stuff. But if anything within it contradicts your creed, which is based on your revelation, you don't have to accept it creedally. You can accept it scientifically, because science is a non-certain thing that is ever evolving and changing, and that you may have paradigm shifts. So accept it scientifically, but just don't accept it creedally. And
to do so would be anti-scientific.
Yeah, and I think that's the best position to have, to be honest. You're not rejecting the science, and you're definitely not rejecting your revelation, which you believe to be true based on things outside of science, which is another discussion.
And many academics hold this approach.
Yeah, of course they do. So brothers and sisters and friends, before we end, everything that we've spoken about today and other previous GDM shows on science, evolution, Darwinism, the philosophy of science, certainty, fact, revelation, history, Islam, all of these things are going to be discussed on the 12th of December. It's a special one-day workshop stroke conference, and it's called Failed Hypothesis. It's a question, Islam, the Quran, and science. Don't miss out on this amazing conference. You'll have a free book to download. You'll have the PowerPoint slides all fully referenced for you to check and for you to do your own further reading. So if you want more answers to these topics or more clarification and more understanding, then don't miss out. 12th December in London, Failed Hypothesis, Islam, the Quran and Science. Be there, register now.